A Boy's Experience at Vicksburg, read by Lieutenant Colonel Frederick D. Grant, late U.S. Army, February 2, 1898. I've always appreciated the good fortune which enabled me to be with my father and his able lieutenants in the field during our great struggle for national existence, and to see for myself the men and the events that made so famous the chapters of our history for the years from 1861 to 1865. In March 1863, while I was at school at Covington, Kentucky, my father gave his consent to my joining him at Young's Point near Vicksburg. I was stimulated to haste by my desire to possess myself of a beautiful Indian pony which Colonel Bowers, of father's staff, had provided especially for me. At arriving at Young's Point, I found my father's headquarters on a steamboat at the levee. I also found my precious pony, had him saddled and bridled immediately, and joined my father on a trip of inspection to the canal. Here he found that the enemy was throwing up fortifications on the opposite side of the river, which so commanded the canal that its use would be impracticable. We returned to headquarters, stopping for consultation with several generals on the way. Here I first saw General Sherman, for whom my father had such unbounded admiration. Later, father went on board Admiral Porter's flagship, the Benton, for a consultation with his naval coadjutor. I accompanied him, but on board the admiral, doubtless remembering the old saying that little pitchers have long ears, called a man to show me all over the ship, everywhere but in the cabin. Not then appreciating the reasons for this special courtesy, I enjoyed my explorations very much. It was during my absence that my father proposed the passage of the Vicksburg batteries. The transports were protected with bales of hay and cotton packed around the boilers. Calls were made for volunteers to man the boats, and the troops were reviewed. The call for boat crews was most eagerly responded to, especially by the men of General Logan's division. Some of the men advanced the most extraordinary reasons for being selected for the service, and their courage and persistency seemed truly marvelous to me. Colonel W.S. Oliver's 8th Missouri Regiment volunteered almost en masse. On the 16th of April, 1863, General Grant and Admiral Porter held a final consultation. About 10 p.m., all lights were put out, and the fleet started down the river. Suddenly, a rocket went up from the shore, a cannon blazed forth from Warrenton, and a shot passed directly in front of our boat. We stopped. A lurid flame sprang up from a house at DeSoto, opposite Vicksburg, then another on the riverfront, and soon fires were burning along the whole front of the city, and the river was lighted as if by sunlight. 6 gunboats looking like great black turtles, followed by 3 fragile transports, moved directly toward the Confederate batteries, which now opened fire. The Benton and the other gunboats responded, and steaming up near the city sent shot and shell pouring into Vicksburg. The transports kept over toward the Louisiana shore, and one, the Henry Clay, was set on fire by a red-hot shell and burned to the water's edge. The people of Vicksburg lined the hills and manifested great excitement. On board our boat, my father and I stood side by side on the hurricane deck. He was quietly smoking, but an intense light shone in his eyes. The scene is as vivid in my mind tonight as it was then to my eyes, and will remain with me always. As soon as our fleet passed the batteries and firing had ceased, father's boat steamed back to Milliken's Bend. The first step of the great campaign had been successfully accomplished. A few days later, I accompanied my father with 8 officers of his staff and an escort of 20 cavalrymen on a ride of 30 miles to visit McPherson at New Carthage. It was a hard day's journey. At the crossing of a slough, where there was but a narrow bridge, my father made one of his daring leaps, putting his horse to the opposite bank, which he just managed to reach. The rest of us preferred to wait our turn at crossing by the bridge, over which a wagon train was slowly passing. We remained that night at New Carthage, my father spending the time conversing with McPherson. The following day we returned to Milliken's Bend. From there, father moved to the head of the army, which now had advanced to Hard Times. The problem now presented itself of getting the troops across the Mississippi River. On the 29th of April, our gunboat steamed down to Grand Gulf and engaged the enemy's batteries for about 5 hours. Father was on board a little tug which moved about amid the fleet. I kept close to him and saw all that was going on. After a trip to the Louisiana shore, we went on board the Benton, and as we entered the porthole, I was sickened by the scenes of carnage. Admiral Porter had been struck on the back of the head with a fragment of shell, and his face showed the agony he was suffering. But he planned a renewal of the conflict for that night, in order to permit our transports to run past the Confederate batteries. During this interview with the Admiral, he asked me if I wanted to stay with him and suggested that I might fill the place of a gunner he had lost. The scene around me dampened my enthusiasm for naval glory, so I replied, "I do not believe that Papa will allow me to serve in the Navy." Our troops now moved down the western bank of the Mississippi to Deshroon's plantation, where the slaves turned out to welcome us with great rejoicing, deeming us the messengers of the Lord, bringing them freedom. The following day, April 30th, we went on board the General Price, formerly a Confederate ram, and moved down to where Bruinsburg had stood. Not a house was to be seen. Fire had destroyed the whole town. The crossing of the troops continued vigorously, and tired of watching them, I fell asleep on deck. Awaking next morning, I found my father had gone to the front, and the sound of cannon announced the progress of a battle. General Lorenzo Thomas told me that the father had given strict orders that I should not be allowed to go ashore. but he finally permitted me to join a party in chasing a rabbit on the land, and I took advantage of that permission to push my investigations over the hills. I fell in with a wagon train and secured a ride on a mule, and after going some distance in that way, I joined a battery of artillery on its way to the front, and later followed a passing regiment, the 7th Missouri, which was soon in battle. Presently my father appeared. My guilty conscience so troubled me that I hid from his sight behind a tree. Within a short time, a mighty shout announced the victory of our troops, and the horrors of a battlefield were brought vividly before me. I joined a detachment which was collecting the dead for burial, but sickening at the sights, I made my way, with another detachment, which was gathering the wounded, to a log house, which had been appropriated for a hospital. Here the scenes were so terrible that I became faint and ill, and making my way to a tree, sat down, the most woe-begone 12-year-old lad in America. Soon an approaching horseman hailed me with a shout. "Why, hello, is that really you?" The horseman was an orderly from my father's escort, and dismounting he proceeded to make me comfortable, putting down his saddle for a pillow, and advised me to go to sleep. This I did, but my sleep was broken by dreams of the horrors I had witnessed. Suddenly I heard the orderly cry out, "Look here, your father's come!" About 50 yards off sat my father drinking coffee from a tin cup. I went to him and was greeted with an exclamation of surprise, as he supposed I was still on board the boat. In after years, he often told the story of my following him to the Battle of Port Gibson with more interest and satisfaction than he manifested to me at that time. The next morning, the burning question was that of transportation. Horses were scarce, but I succeeded in getting a mount. 2 enormous white artillery horses had been captured the day before, and I secured one of them, and Mr. Charles A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, the other. Mr. Dana, however, had the advantage of riding the horse with saddle and bridle, and I had to content myself with improvising a harness made of a clothesline and the tree of a side saddle without stirrups. Badly equipped as I was, many others were worse off in the beginning of the campaign. At any rate, the sight of a small boy and the big white horse made some sport on the road for the soldiers I passed, or those who passed me. At Port Gibson, General Logan came to see Father, who complimented him highly on his operations the previous day. On leaving, General Logan turned to me and said, "Come, my boy, and I will show you the prettiest fight you will ever see." We went down to the lower suspension bridge to secure the crossing as my father had ordered. I returned to Port Gibson, and finding that my father had left, I followed the troops which were crossing the bayou. I rode on quite a distance, and then stopping at a house where some officers were sleeping on a porch, I crawled in for a nap between 2 of them. They awoke and said things, but when I mentioned my name, one of them, Colonel after General Sanborn, welcomed me kindly and lent me part of his overcoat for a pillow. Becoming very cold toward dawn, I went indoors, found a bed with 2 occupants, and crept in between them. It was now the 3rd of May, and I found my father at the North Fork, watching the crossing of the troops. Finding that I was lame from the falling of my horse the day before, Father, who was ever kind and thoughtful, insisted that I should take his mount, a horse belonging to General A.J. Smith. All of Father's horses were at this time on the other side of the Mississippi. We moved toward Hankinson's Ferry. At the forks of the road, it became necessary to clear away a body of the enemy's troops. With slight loss and the capture of some prisoners, this was accomplished, and we moved to the Grand Gulf. Here we found our old friend, the Benton, and the gallant Admiral, who welcomed us most cordially. He gave Father a bundle of dispatches, including one from General Banks, who said that he could not reach Port Hudson as soon as he had expected, and that he would have fewer troops than he had counted upon. General Grant immediately began to write dispatches, a task at which he continued till 2 o'clock in the morning, when he borrowed a change of linen, ordered his horse, and started for McPherson's quarters. The next day, Colonel Lagow, in whose charge I had been left, started on after Father, and we overtook him at Rocky Springs. Near here, General Sherman with the 15th Corps joined us, and he and Father had some long conversations. From the 7th to the 12th of May, General Grant was constantly in communication with Sherman, McPherson, and McClernand, riding around from one to the other. This made his headquarters so uncomfortable and his mess so irregular that I, for one, did not propose to put up with such living, and I took my meals with the soldiers, who used to do a little foraging, and thereby set an infinitely better table than their commanding general. My father's table at this time was, I must frankly say, the worst I ever saw or partook of. On the 12th of May, the Union Army was pushed forward, and at 14 Mile Creek at Osterhouse had a skirmish to clear the road. We heard the sounds of battle away off to the right, and later we learned that McPherson had won the day at Raymond. I had struck up a friendly acquaintance with one of the orderlies called Pony. At 14 Mile Creek, he and I rode out on an independent trip, and seeing 10 or 12 horses tied up in front of a house, we conceived the idea of capturing the mounts, and possibly the riders also, who were inside the house. Not until we had gone too far to retreat did the idea occur to us that the would-be captors might possibly become the captured. It was with great relief that we saw a man wearing a blue uniform come out of the house, and we then discovered that the party we had proposed to capture was a detachment of Sherman's Signal Corps. Later on, trying to get back within our own lines, we had some difficulty in convincing the pickets that we were entitled to pass. The next day I went over the battlefield of Raymond, and here again I saw the horrors of war, the wounded and the unburied dead. We spent the night at Raymond and then started for Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. While passing through a piece of dense woods on the way, the enemy sharpshooters opened fire on us, and one of the staff shouted to my father that they were aiming at him. His answer was to turn his horse and dash into the woods in the direction whence the bullets were coming. Colonels Wilson and Lagow, I, the orderlies, and the escort followed, and in skirmishing fashion we advanced till we came to a large house where we halted. Sherman's corps now came up, and McPherson to our left was already engaged. Generals Grant and Sherman were on the porch of the old house when our line was broken by artillery fire, and our men began to retreat. The two generals immediately mounted, rode among the men, and reformed them. And meanwhile, Tuttle's division had passed through the dense woods and had captured the enemy's breastworks, and wheeling to the left, advancing up the line of entrenchments. Father accompanied them. Thinking the battle was ended, I rode off toward the State House, where the Confederate troops passed me in their retreat. Though I wore a blue uniform, I was so splashed with mud and looked generally so unattractive that the Confederates paid no attention to me. I have since realized that even had I been captured, it would not have ended the war. At this time, I saw a mounted officer with a Union flag advancing toward the Capitol. I followed him into the building and entered the governor's room, which had been hastily abandoned. Finding what I supposed to be the governor's pipe lying on the table, I confiscated it, primarily and ostensibly for the national service, but secondarily and actually for my own private and individual use. It had the advantage of being still loaded and lighted. Returning to the street, I saw the officer whom I had followed in the act of raising the Union flag over the building. He proved to be Captain, afterwards Colonel, Cornelius Cadle. Father and his staff, advancing at the head of the army, soon reached the State House, where I joined them and went with them to the Bowen House, the best hotel in Jackson, where we took the room in which General Joseph E. Johnson had slept the night before. At Jackson, we captured an important prisoner who was carrying dispatches from Johnston to Pemberton. The information gained from these dispatches caused some activity at headquarters, and the next day, May 15th, the army started off in the direction of Vicksburg. That night, while sleeping in the room with my father, Clinton, I was awakened by a great knocking. Colonel Lagow announced the arrival of a messenger from McPherson, and father seemed surprised at the news he received. He gave orders for an early start in the morning, went back to bed, and was soon sleeping quietly again. After a light breakfast before daybreak, we moved rapidly to the front, General Grant keeping well ahead of the rest of us. At Champion's Farm, we came upon the enemy and were soon in the midst of a terrific firing. Staff officers were dispatched to various points, and very soon father and I were left alone. Our line broke and was falling back when father moved forward, rallied the men, and passed over from Hovey's division to McPherson's corps, putting the latter into action. There were now 15,000 men in our line, which was about 3 miles long, and the battle raged fiercely along its whole extent. McPherson, dressed in full uniform, was mounted on a beautiful black horse. Fighting Jack Logan, also in full uniform, was mounted on a white horse. And as they passed to and fro, exposing themselves recklessly, they made a most superb picture. General Grant rode to all parts of the field, giving orders to the generals and dispatching his staff in all directions. Hovey was sustaining the heaviest part of the encounter. Suddenly hearty cheering was heard on the right of the line, and father moved over in that direction to find 3,000 prisoners taken with 18 guns. After the battle of Champion's Hill, while riding toward Edwards Station, father suddenly turned back, and I went on to a house filled with Confederate wounded. They were not feeling very friendly toward the Yankees, and they threatened to kill me. Of course, I decided not to intrude, and I passed on. Further down the road, some of our own men, who did not know me, attempted to take me prisoner. Soon, however, an old soldier recognized me and called for 3 cheers for young Grant, which were given with a will, and I began to feel more comfortable. After midnight, I returned to the field and reached a house in which I found my father and several of his staff officers, most of whom were greatly elated over their victory. I slept in the room with my father that night, even after the great battle and victory of the day, and with the expectation and cares of another battle tomorrow, was, as ever, most considerate of the comfort and welfare of his young son. The next morning we made an early start and moved toward the Big Black River. When we halted near the railway bridge, General Grant and his staff occupied the porch of a fine plantation house. Our troops were now moving on the enemy's line at double quick, and I became enthused with the spirit of the occasion, galloped across a cotton field, and went over the enemy's works with our men. Following the retreating Confederates to Big Black, I was watching some of them swim the river, when a sharpshooter on the opposite bank fired at me and hit me in the leg. The wound was slight but very painful, and I suppose I was very pale, for Colonel Lagow came dashing up and asked what was the matter. I promptly said, "I'm killed." Perhaps because I was only a boy, the colonel presumed to doubt my word, and said, "Move your toes," which I did with success. He then recommended our hasty retreat. This we accomplished in good order. After the capture of the fortifications, May 17th, our army bridged the Big Black and crossed during the night. On May 18th, we reached the summit of Walnut Hills just behind Vicksburg, whence we could see the Mississippi and Chickasaw Bayou, where Sherman had fought in December. Sherman was greatly elated over the success of the present campaign, and so expressed himself enthusiastically. Several outworks were captured that day. During the 19th, father spent much of his time with McClernand on the extreme left. He feared lest Pemberton might make his escape through this thinly guarded part of our line. The 20th and 21st were spent in skirmishing and in advancing our lines as much as possible. On the 22nd, the great assault was made upon the fortifications. Early in the day, General Grant had a narrow escape from a shell fired directly down a ravine, which he had just entered. He was unhurt, however, but was covered with yellow dirt thrown up by the explosion. On this day, I saw a sight that will probably never again be witnessed in this country, an artillery duel extending over 7 miles in length. Beneath the smoke of this cannonading, the Army of the Tennessee could be seen moving to the assault upon the enemy's lines, which became a sheet of fire from the forts and rifle pits. At one point, our flag was planted right at the base of the enemy's parapet. An incident of this day's work was illustrative of youthful heroism and of my father's tender nature. A small boy with blood streaming from a wound in his leg came running up to where Father and Sherman stood, and reported that his regiment was out of ammunition. Sherman was directing some attention to be paid to his wound when the little fellow, finding himself fainting from loss of blood, gasped out, "Caliber 56," as he was carried off to the rear. At this moment I observed my father's eyes were filled with tears. The wound I had received early in the campaign now began to trouble me very much, and under Dr. Hewitt's expressed fears of having to amputate my leg, I remained much at headquarters. Because of this, I saw a great deal of my father's methods, his marvelous attention to detail, and his cool self-possession. I also witnessed the devotion of his men to him, and the enthusiasm with which they greeted the old man, as they called him, when he passed along the lines. Father was a splendid horseman and visited many points of his army every day. General Sherman commanded the 15th Corps during part of the siege of Vicksburg, and the remainder of the time he had commanded the troops placed from Haynes' Bluff to the Big Black to guard our rear. His personality is too well known for me to describe it here, but it is a pleasure for me to bear witness to my father's affection for Sherman and his esteem for his soldierly qualities. Indeed, it gave General Grant more pleasure to see Sherman honored and rewarded than it did to receive such tributes himself. Sherman was impetuous in action, brilliant in conversation, and thoroughly versed in the art of war, but he was always thoroughly subordinate and ready to obey promptly any order given to him. 2 hours' notice was amply sufficient for him to get under way to execute any desired movement. On the 15th of May, he was at Jackson, Mississippi, and that night General Grant, desiring him to move to the front, sent him orders to that effect. On the afternoon of the 16th, he arrived at Bolton with the head of his corps, having marched 25 or 30 miles that day, and he would have been in the battle at Champion's Hill had the enemy waited in the field a little longer. I had the pleasure of being under fire with General Sherman several times, and like his troops, I was inspired with great enthusiasm. The next officer in rank, the commander of the 17th Corps, was Major General James B. McPherson, the Bayard of the Army of the Tennessee. Mounted on horseback, young and handsome, always splendidly dressed, and most courtly in manner, he was the very impersonation of a knight. General Grant always regarded McPherson as the most promising officer of his age in the army, and on his death, Father said that he had lost one of his best friends and the country one of his ablest defenders. McPherson's troops loved him, and the one needs here but once the cheers given by the Army of the Tennessee whenever his name is mentioned in its presence, to appreciate the love and devotion with which his memory is still cherished. His very taking off was illustrative of the man. When ordered to surrender before Atlanta, he courteously lifted his hat, bowed low, wheeled his horse, and dashed into the woods. But the volley that instantly followed was but too well aimed, and he fell. To me he was particularly kind, and I grieved deeply over his death. Among the division commanders whom I was fortunate enough to see upon the field of battle were Generals Logan, Steele, Johnny Smith, Crocker, A.J. Smith, Tuttle, Osterhaus, Blair, Ranson, and Hovey. I've heard my father say that with such officers an army must be irresistible. There were others, besides those I have mentioned, whose names and memories are alike honored for their services in defense of their country, one of the most distinguished of whom was our honored companion, General G.M. Dodge, who was presiding here tonight. The siege of Vicksburg continued after the assaults of the 23rd of May without much excitement except such as was caused by the reports that Johnson was about to attack our rear. General Grant, however, made a personal inspection trip, upon which I accompanied him, back to the Big Black and found everything secure and well guarded under the watchful care of General Sherman. The siege went on. Our parallels slowly but surely approached the doomed city. Deserters came in more frequently and reported the desperate condition of the garrison. Rumors also came to us that Johnson was going to make a determined effort to relieve Pemberton. These reports led to another rumor that our troops would celebrate the 4th of July by a grand storming of the works. Doubtless this rumor found its way into the beleaguered city, for on the morning of the 3rd of July a flag of truce was announced. General Grant betrayed no excitement, but in the afternoon he rode out with his staff to a point opposite Fort Hill, and I accompanied them. Soon a white flag appeared over the enemy's works, and a party of Confederates was seen approaching. Firing ceased, and under an old tree General Grant met his opponent. The other officers separated into groups and conversed, while the works on both sides were lined with soldiers. The consultation of the commanding generals lasted a short while, and presently both parties retired to their own quarters. Father was immediately joined by the largest assemblage of general officers which I had ever seen. the heroes of this most brilliant campaign and siege deciding upon and settling the fate of their foes. They had conquered and taken in their power the largest number of men and the greatest quantity of war material and spoils ever surrendered in battle. After conversation, General Grant dispatched a note to the defender of Vicksburg, and the group of officers dispersed. I remained in the tent, sitting on my little cot and feeling restless but scarcely knowing why. Father sat at his table writing. Presently a messenger handed Father a note. He opened it, gave a sigh of relief, and said calmly, "Vicksburg has surrendered." I was thus the first to hear officially announced the news of the fall of the Gibraltar of America, and filled with enthusiasm, I ran out to spread the glad tidings. Officers rapidly assembled, and there was a general rejoicing. The next day, the glorious 4th, as Father was starting for the front of the Jackson Road, the booming of the guns was heard, and apparently on our right, General Grant looked vexed, and was about to order the arrest of General Steele, whom he supposed to be responsible, saying that he ought to know better than to allow any triumphing over a conquered countryman. When Steele himself rode up, the firing was definitely located on our left, and the salutes were stopped. Soon after, the Confederates were seen filing out of their works and stacking their arms. 31,600 brave men surrendering, 170 cannon, and 60,000 muskets to the conquering but lenient Army of the Tennessee. Their arms being given up, the troops passed back into the city, and General Grant, at the head of the Army of the Tennessee, moved forward to take possession. His reception by General Pemberton was most frigid. With a group of Confederate officers, Pemberton was seated on the porch of a large house, but when Father expressed a desire for a glass of water, he was allowed to go to hunt for it in the kitchen. This surly reception to the man who would not allow his men to celebrate their victory was deeply resented by the members of General Grant's staff, but Father was satisfied with his success in capturing Vicksburg and manifested no resentment. The Confederate officers who thus received him gratefully appreciated later on the clemency they experienced at the fall of Vicksburg, and expressed this appreciation in the most touching manner during General Grant's last illness at the time of his funeral, and at the dedication of his tomb. Passing through the city where the Union flag had already been hoisted over the courthouse, General Grant went on board the Benton, where Admiral Porter congratulated him upon the victory. The next day he established headquarters at the house of a Mr. Lum, who soon became his warm friend, and during my father's last illness, some of the most beautiful letters received by us were from members of this charming Vicksburg family. This ended my connection with the Army for a while. From the result of exposure, I had contracted an illness, which necessitated my withdrawal into civilian life again, and on the 8th of July I was sent home to recuperate. I did not rejoin my father until after the Battle of Chattanooga. I remember with the utmost interest my life in camp, and with deepest affection the men whom I met in the Army. Much of my time was spent among the private soldiers, who were never too tired or too worn out to comfort and pet the young boy, the son of the old man. Young as I was then, my camp life was of such nature. I saw so much of the hardships, the self-denials, the sufferings and labors of both privates and officers, that my proudest moments are when, like tonight, I am associating with the old warriors, the veteran comrades of my father.